everybody. Welcome. My name is Daphne Reese, and it is my honor and privilege to introduce someone that I feel is doing just amazing work. Historically, in anarchist spaces, and we were just talking about this too earlier, women haven't always felt like we belong, right? We've often felt like, oh, we're just the girlfriends, right? The partners, whatever of these anarchist men. We haven't always felt like this is a space that we can navigate. And I think that it's so important that we recognize that and that we hold space for us, for women of color. And with everything that's been going on, and I'm so touched, I'm just so honored and privileged that Zoe Samudzi, who you will who will talk to us about how Black feminism informs her anarchism, how coalition building and community building between brown and Black folk strengthens us and makes this community that's often seen as being very homogenized, very Anglo, very cis, very etc., how we can hold these spaces and we can
do the work.
We can do the work. Thank you. We can do the work. Thank you. So it's my honor. Welcome, Zoe Samudzi. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone. I'm really people are standing. I'm really excited to be here. I much prefer to have kind of generative dialogue spaces than to talk at you, so I'm gonna try to keep it on the shorter side, and then we can have some more conversation about what I am trying to talk about. So, in her 1983 literary work, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Alice Walker described a womanist as, quote, a woman who loves another woman, sexually and or non-sexually. She appreciates and prefers women's culture, women's emotional flexibility. She's committed to the survival and the wholeness of an entire people. She's not a separatist, except periodically for health. She loves the spirit, she loves struggle, she loves herself, regardless. So I have a really complicated relationship with political theory, particularly as somebody that studied political science as an undergraduate. And my relationship to political theory, especially to the kind of horribly white supremacist Enlightenment values of rationality and objectivity, is generally like a knee-jerk reaction to the whiteness and the Eurocentricity of it and of the canon. And with regards to anarchism specifically, I often feel alienated from the theory because of the non-white and non-Western globality of the politics of the ideology that have all of a sudden been turned into this white politic. Anarchistic values of horizontalism, of mutual aid, of voluntary participation, of non-extra or markedly anti-state organization existed prior to Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's self-description of anarchist in the mid-1800s, or William Godwin's framework-laying work in the 1790s. And I say this, what I'm about to say, in the same vein that Russell Means of the American Indian Movement sought to resist being Europeanized. And he said that, like capitalism, Marxism is right smack in the middle of European tradition, and the Hegelian dialectic is a secularizing theory that is even further despiritualized and despiritualizes humanity, that we kind of end up also seeing in industrialization and Marxist materialism. So I want to share a confession that's made me a bit unpopular in different anarchist communities that I've kind of tried to involve myself in. And I don't read canonical anarchist theory, and I have no intention to. I've read some of, and I deeply value Emma Goldman's development of anarcho-feminism, but I've never read Kropotkin, I've never read Bakunin, and I don't plan to anytime soon. My most important and foundational left politics have been derived from observing organizations and political formations themselves. The Black Panther Party taught me what it looked like to apply Maoism in the development of a racialized resistance politic for community self-determination. The Zapatismo taught me about the synthesis of articulated indigenous practices and sovereignty and sociocultural organization with familiar principles and ideologies. African liberation leaders like Amilcar Cabral and Thomas Sankara taught me what a culturally relevant post-colonial formation and an agrarian revolution might look like on the continent, unfortunately before they were both assassinated. And Brazil's landless workers movements, and South Africa's Abahlali Basimjondolo, which is a shack dwellers movement, and they're about land reclamation and about widespread democratization processes, beginning with the most poor and most disenfranchised communities in the country. Taught me what it meant to organize around and claim resources. And indigenous peoples and First Nations peoples of North America taught me what sovereignty meant. And in addition to these global struggles, I'm deeply inspired by the myriad ways that Black people have resisted in the Americas and throughout the African diaspora. Boaventura de Sousa Santos, so I do read a ton of theory, I just don't read white dudes. He developed a concept of societal fascism, which describes the mechanisms and the logics of state formation wherein whole populations are excluded prior to or after the formation of a social contract. Pre-contractual exclusion refers to populations that have never been part of and can never be a part of the social contract. So in the United States, think of indigenous people, think of Black people. And post-contractual exclusion or ejection from the contract means that a given population could enjoy conditional access to the contract. Think of immigrants who had to appeal to a proximity to whiteness in order to become American citizens. Think of poor white people who are part of the contract with the merit of their whiteness but excluded because of their working classes. And Black people, obviously, as I said, exist within the former realm of exclusion because Black people are residents within a settler colony predicated upon both the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of African peoples. And despite formal emancipation in 1865, Blackness can only be perpetually relegated to the afterlife of slavery as long as the settler project continues to exist. And though we're formally bond to the laws of the land, Black America can be understood as an extra state entity because they are not a part of the social contract. And because of this location, I understand Blackness in so many ways to be anarchistic. African Americans, that is the ethno-social identity of descendants of enslaved African people, have innovated new cultures and social organizations, much like anarchism would require us to do outside of the state structure in the event that the revolution happens tomorrow. Black radical formations are fundamentally anti-fascist, despite often and generally functioning outside of conventional Antifa spaces, and Black people have engaged in anarchistic resistances since our arrival in the Americas. From slave ship and plantation rebellions during enslavement to post-emancipation labor and prison camp uprisings, to Harriet Tubman's literal removal of enslaved people from the custody of their owners, to the creation of maroon societies in the South, to combating the historic and present collusion between state law enforcement and white supremacist groups. Assertions of Black personhood, humanity, liberation have always called into question both the foundation and the legitimacy of the American state. So given this particular positionality and the historical and contemporary relationship that Black people do have to the state, I'm developing an analysis from this particular position as opposed to simply analysis of the position. That is, I'm kind of trying to develop a decolonized dialectic because I'm in the midst of reading Decolonizing Dialectics, which I would actually recommend reading. And Marx and Engels have provided us admittedly useful dialectical tools for understanding history, state formation, class. And these are tools that have been adopted and adapted by countless resistances to colonialism all around the world. But I find Cedric Robinson's critiques of Marxian shortcomings to be incredibly useful, particularly when he writes around the non-universal applicability of kind of orthodox Western political thought, these processes of industrialization and proletariatization, and the failure to account for the inherently racial character of capitalism. In his 1997 article, Identity, Politics, and Class Struggle, Robin D.G. Kelly writes that class is lived through race and gender, highlighting both the inextricability of race and gender with class and the necessity for an anti-capitalist identity politic. Yes, I said it, I'm a firm believer in identity politics, that instrumentalizes unique experiences and understandings from a particular social positionality within racial capitalist regimes. And it's not simply enough to center Blackness, right? To toss it into your analysis once you've created this grand theory of how oppression functions and how the state functions. But I specifically want to center Black womanhood because of the ways in which race is inextricably linked to and co-constituted through gender. And if anarchism is to be of any use to me, I must have an anarchism that speaks directly to my needs and vulnerabilities as a Black woman, and to Black women of all stripes and all identities. If you're unaware, there have been a spate of kidnappings of Black girls and disappearances of Black women across the country. There are ongoing bold murders of Black trans women. Why is this? Because Black women's safety is a non-priority of the state, and every predator knows this. We are being hunted, but this hunting season is grossly and under-addressed because of the degendering of anti-racist politics, because of the way that Black womanhood is made invisible through diversity language around women and people of color, that overlooks the intersections of race and gender, because of the erasure of Black womanhood through women of color, and because of the understandings of the ways that state violence against Black bodies tends to focus on the humiliation and emasculation and almost soul targeting of cisgender Black men. And so I hope to speak to a Black feminist anarchism, an identity politic, a dialectic, and an analytical framework that specifically addresses these urgent material needs. So first, womanism, right? Womanism is the social theory based on the race and gender oppression of Black women that is rooted in materiality, lived experience, and embodied knowledge. Womanist theologian Dolores Williams describes this embodied activism as being associated with traditions and resistances that are formed from different conditions, events, sociocultural and contextual meaning, and all of the different values that these things have within Blackness. And womanism offers two things for me in particular. It offers the opportunity to break from traditional definitions of womanhood, where cis Black womanhood is othered and Black trans womanhood is doubly othered in the way that it presents a threat to gender hegemony and to the gendered anxiety of us as cis women. The second thing that it presents to me is the emphasis of kinship and community over individuality. Womanism seeks to reconcile Black women's relationships with one another and with nature, most notably our deeply commodified and violated bodies over which we have historically had very little agency, our physical environment, and our spirituality. Now, Black feminism says that sexism and misogyny, gender identity, class depression, and racism are inextricably linked in a mutually constitutive web of, to quote Patricia Collins, and I'm sure as you've all heard, interlocking systems of oppression. And within this tradition, of course, is Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, which builds off of the Combahee River Collective's simultaneity and even 19th century Black feminist works like that of Anna Julia Cooper. Black feminism, too, seeks to ground political understandings and anti-capitalist critiques in embodied knowledges and in lived experiences, and also present a non-essentialized and non-biologized critique of Black womanhood's identity and position within history. A useful historical revisionism that highlights racial capitalism's critical subjugation and Black nationalism's exclusion of Black women. And it presents a response to the racist exclusion of Black women from women's issues around safety, deservingness, agency, autonomy, and class oppression. And understanding Black women's unique subjugation by the state means understanding race and gendered labor extraction within capitalism. Most incisively, the ways in which Black feminism is a modality for understanding how the anti-Black settler state is a fundamentally illegitimate construction. And unlike what Jacobin and their class fetishizing ilk of all sectarian stripes might tell you, intersectionality does not undermine Marxism or anything. It doesn't. They're wrong. So what does it mean to properly understand Black women's subjugation? It means to understand the ways in which Black women's labor was central to the development of the capitalist state and to the American slaveocracy. Sarah Haley's book, No Mercy Here, outlines the myriad ways in which gendered anti-Blackness forms the construction of the Jim Crow system. It paves the way for the contemporary systems of mass incarceration and school-to-prison pipelining that we see today. Haley's book makes direct comparison between the hyper-imprisonability of Black women's gender deviance and the redeemability of white femininity, and the ways in which these constructs were made oppositional and reified through judicial sentencing that enforced Black women's subjection. Black women were thought to be as strong as men, and were frequently used for all kinds of labor, whereas white women were only employed in fields as punishment for particularly bad behavior. Where black men were 1.4 times more likely than white men to be arrested, black women were 6.4 more times likely than white women to be arrested. And it becomes evident that white women's normativity is made more and more concrete through the tripled labor, the domestic, industrial, and sexual, euphemistically called social reproductive labor, as black women became the playthings for prisoners, and male approximate punishment. White women ultimately became exempted from chain gang labor. There was literally legislation saying that white women were not allowed to work on chain gangs. And they were the only demographic to be protected from carceral punishment in this way. And this codifies the race-gender normativity and highlights the ways in which carcerality and punishment operate in service of white womanhood, and how carceral gendering enforce both white women's superiority and black women's distance from innocence. So then when we look at contemporary anti-racist politics, right, we look at the ways that black humanity and personhood continues to be evaluated through the impossible to attain lens of innocence within the white liberal imagination. In Against Innocence, Race and Gender and the Politics of Safety, Jackie Wang constructs a framework for understanding black personhood and victimization that resonates really deeply with me and kind of sits at the bedrock of all of what I'm talking about. And she writes on this phenomenon saying that innocence becomes the precondition for launching anti-racist campaigns. Campaigns where empathy can only be established if and when black people are able to pass rigorous tests of moral purity. So for example, we can agree for the most part that Tamir Rice was egregiously victimized because he was a child. And also because we saw the video, but that's a different story. And empathy was a product of his youthfulness, and that's the same with Aiyana Jones. But Mike Brown was not enough of a victim because he may or may not have committed strong-arm robbery, and Darren Wilson's testimony added to the process of what Frank Wilderson refers to as niggerization. We now know that Mike Brown did not commit strong-arm robbery, but whether or not he did should not affect whether or not you believe that extrajudicial assassination is suddenly a reasonable punishment for robbing a convenience store. We didn't, however, see this overwhelming outpouring of empathy and support for Cece McDonald, a black trans woman who was convicted of second-degree manslaughter after killing an attacker that violently confronted her with first racist and transmisogynist language and then smashed a drink against her face. She accepted a plea bargain of 41 months in prison in June 2012, served 19 months in 2 different men's facilities, which is another story, prior to her release in January 2014. Now, given the epidemic murders of black trans women, is her defensive violence not warranted? Is she not innocent enough? And what makes her less innocent, and we're not using these juridical measures of guilt and innocence that the state kind of arbitrarily lays out, but what makes her less innocent than, say, Marissa Alexander, who fired a warning shot in the air after her husband attacked and threatened to kill her? And there was far more outcry about the gendered implications of women invoking stand your ground laws than there was about the perfectly reasonable use of any form of violence in response to the assault on black trans women's personhood. Perhaps because in the case of Alexander, white liberals, particularly white feminists, were able to apply their carceral logics of protecting the world from scary brown men that sits at the root of so many anti-domestic and intimate partner violence interventions. Now, where there were so many anti-racist logics, even ones that emerge from radical spaces, appeal to innocence, we continue to rely on the logics of the white imaginary and draw upon exceptional cases to buttress our arguments. But ultimately, in doing so, we affirm illegitimate modes of governance and social regulation in an illegitimate state. Reliance upon empathy fails to produce a politics that unequivocally affirms black humanity. And doling out our own judgments of who we perceive to be innocent and who we perceive to not be innocent enough fails to actually articulate the state's relationship to and production of blackness. So to return to Frank Wilderson, if one were to ask the police why they shot a black person, they would say, I shot you because you are black. You are black because I shot you. We are blackened, we are made black by the logics of violence that are born out of chattel enslavement in the Americas, colonial subjugation on the continent. Innocence defenses can only ever be flawed because the disciplinary and extractive systems erected around us, the ghetto, the plantation, the prison, the colony, can only ever define us solely through our criminality, our deviance, our ongoing existence as both capital and a heavily subsidized labor force for the state. We can never be innocent. And the issue is not the brutalized and slain Black individuals we decide to immortalize through hashtags after death, but rather our fundamentally criminal subject position. The state does not produce anti-Black socialities. The state is anti-Black sociality. If it isn't yet obvious, my almost single-minded focus within a Black feminist anarchism is that of safety. We should be able to rely on mainstream feminism because we're women, but we're precluded from white supremacist notions of womanhood, an exclusion that's doubly compounded for trans women. And white women are only virtuous and worth protection because Black women are not. Protecting white women includes a regulation of public space and criminalization of personhood that still victimizes Black women. We're unable to rely upon popular criticisms of police misconduct that fail to understand that violence and murder of Black people is not an indiscretion and bad behavior on the behalf of police officers. It's not something that can be trained away by a diversity training, but it's rather the output of white supremacist settler colonial machinations. It can never not happen, again, as long as the state continues to exist. Never mind that the African American Policy Forum, of which Kimberly Crenshaw is a member, had to coin the Say Her Name hashtag in February 2015 because of Black women's exclusion from these narratives and memorializations of victims of police violence. Because how can you indict the state for violence against Black bodies when, in a post-Daniel Holtzclaw conviction world, we're still failing to highlight the racialized gendered violence that has characterized it since its inception, and that the state has imposed, and the means by which the state has imposed its violence against Black women's bodies. Excuse me. Furthermore, how do we have the audacity as anti-capitalists or anarchists, or however we self-define, to name anti-Blackness while failing to have Black people in organizing spaces? And how do we entertain these lazy rejections of identity politics when our politicized way of knowing and resisting and understanding are a product of the embodied knowledges that come from our marginalized identities? Wang discusses the idea of these zones of intelligibility, that is, spaces of being and habitation and navigation that are understandable to white people. She highlights the fact that perhaps there was so much support that was mobilized for Trayvon Martin, for Oscar Grant, because both were murdered in places that were intelligible and understandable to white imaginations. Trayvon Martin was killed in a gated community, and Oscar Grant was murdered in a public transportation station. Still, she writes, there are violences that occur and have occurred in ultimate universes, like the slave ship, the hood, the prison, at the hands of the state. But what happens when you're unable to articulate the violence of and from your subject position because you possess an unintelligible identity, as is possessed by Black people? Hence the need to constantly perform the dehumanizing mental gymnastics of appealing to an innocence that we can never attain. What happens when the violence is simply a logical extension of the politics you either knowingly or unknowingly enable and perpetuate? When white liberals favor order over justice, they by extension support segregatory policy and ghetto policing because that's what order is. Perhaps part of our silence about the murders of Black trans women, both by Black and non-Black cis communities, is because the violence and abuse they experience is the logical extension of the cis-normativity that materializes our very identities as cisgender people. Because as with cis Black people killed by the state, we name and exceptionalize and count and dead name the murdered transgender women. But we fail to interrogate the way that cis-normativity and gender regulation are central to white supremacist state making. You need only look at the way that Cece and Chelsea Manning and nearly every other trans woman is placed into male facilities or in administrative segregation for their own protection, which is tantamount to torture. So we've got to reject this innocence in favor of a politic of Black women's deservingness of safety in a world where Black womanhood is unviolable and unrapeable. And even in childhood, we're still hypersexual, baby Jezebel, fast-tailed girls. And innocence is impossible for us to attain. So, that's all I have, because I want us to have a conversation. But I'm hoping to kind of build more upon this, and I think that we have some interesting conversations to have. accept these kind of questions.
Do you want to take Q&A?
Yeah.
A little bit?
Yeah.
All right. Anybody have questions? Raise your
Questions,
hand.
comments.
Comments?
Yeah.
Madeline?
What does safety look like?
And that's the thing, right? When I was writing it, and the reason that it kind of cuts off abruptly is because I don't know what that means yet. I don't know what it means to be safe as a Black woman. And as much as it's important to try and criticize the fact that we're not safe, I think there's something that's deeply troubling about the fact that it's so difficult to try and name what safety looks like. But for me, safety looks like, especially, you know, when we've got, if we have kind of comrades, right? Safety for me means that I would, except for, I guess, the most extenuating circumstances, never have to call the police. That I would be able to rely upon people who are invested enough in my safety as a Black woman to try to come and to do whatever transformative justice, de-escalation, whatever things would need to be done, so I could keep myself as far removed from the state. Because part of my whole conception of safety means as little interaction with agents of the state as possible. That's not complete, but that, given the kind of history that I tried to go through, is one of the most kind of fundamental things for me. And that means renegotiating kind of a policy of like, or a politic of like anti-violence, right? When it comes to intimate partner violence. Because I don't have an investment in sending Black men to jail, but I fundamentally refuse to, in the name of Black whatever, to continue to allow rapists to sit in our midst, abusers to sit in our midst. And it means not only in our kind of ethno-racial communities, but in our organizing communities, that we develop the fucking principles that when you know and you are harboring a rapist buddy of yours, that you say something. Because the safety of the community of your comrades is more important than your, you know, fucking machismo or whatever. So, I don't know. It's not, what do you think?
What I think is that having affirmative stances and places that we can begin to create the kind of world that we want to live in needs to start becoming bigger than when we're saying no, knowing what our yes looks like. And I think that it's very hard to live into that new place without beginning to actually create it. And I recognize you saying that you're looking at that understanding, and the thing that came to mind just now when you said harboring people who are acting in those ways, that I've heard about Native American communities in Canada that actually have used restorative justice practices to help folks that have actually abused people within their own communities to actually start using that restorative justice practice to actually heal. And they stay within the community because they also went through their oppressive molestation when people were taken away, and they actually are learning to heal together and stay in the community and heal. So I don't know what that looks like either because I haven't seen it myself, but I know that it's happening somewhere.
And there's something else that bothers me about kind of mainstream feminism, these kind of memes and jokes of like kill all men or whatever, which is like, yeah, often I feel the same way, but also there's this really insidious way in which white women articulating that as a politic has historically led to the kind of slaughtering of Black and brown men, right? Like white women's virtuosity is a product of the criminalization of Black bodies, which means, yes, not Black bodies, like bodies of color. So it means that, you know, when you're already a criminal and a white woman self, you looked, Emmett Till, and then years later the woman said, oh, I lied about it. It doesn't matter whether or not she lied about it. You know, it's this way in which my understanding of feminism necessarily has to not center, but include kind of the well-being of men in my community, because when we are abused, we are more likely to be abused by those men. And so what does it mean in understanding community to also understand these new ways of being a man that are not hegemonic, that are not constrained to masculinity being actualized through violence and entitlement over women's bodies and all of these things. We can look up some sort of just to see if that sounds really good. And useful.
Any other questions, comments?
I think that's a very good point. I'm always talking about, like there's that saying, don't teach a woman how to defend herself in the attack, but teach the attacker not to attack. But right now we live in a system that is teaching men to attack. We live in a system that, as you named, is teaching predominantly black and brown men to not respect women's bodies, especially trans women's. And so, like, thinking of, like, that kind of connection around, yes, educate, but at the same time, let's defend ourselves. Like, you know, I know that, like, some groups that shall remain nameless teach everything as a weapon workshops, right? I think for me, safety is also, like you said, community. Yo, it's so hard when you're getting it. And when you defend somebody and then the next day that person doesn't do shit for you. And it's like this thing of, yeah, I'm gonna do it without knowing or without thinking you're gonna do it for me, but it's also like, if I'm doing it for you, we are all family.
What is community if not reciprocity, right?
Right. And it's like some communities, like I live in Skid Row, some communities like Skid Row, they don't have that. Like, and it's because of the trauma, it's because of post-traumatic slave syndrome, it's because of all of these things you were talking about, right? So it's acknowledging the different oppressions and privileges. I'm gonna keep it real, that even come with the language you were speaking, right? Like I'm sitting here like interpreting it for myself in my head. I'm like, was she saying that? I get you now, yeah.
No,
You know,
for sure,
because
for
like
sure.
I'm not a college grad, you know. So it's just like acknowledging where our positionality and power. You know, like the accessibility of these like community spaces.
Because black womanhood is not flat. I'm not disabled. I'm doing a PhD. I'm cis. Like, there's a totem pole. And as much as like I'm not about to try and play the oppression Olympics, I'm not about to pretend that within black womanhood we are oppressed identically. You know. Yeah.
I always think of safety as something that's relative to my environment, or like in media they say diegesis, which is like a place where the character develops. So for me, I'm always thinking about it as somebody who's non-gender conforming. I'm always thinking about safety and how I can be safe. Recently I stopped just taking public transportation, which is a privilege, because that's a place where a lot of the assault was occurring. And so I think of it too, but I'm from Minnesota, so there's a really strong like white environment. So I consider the term that I came up with in college was called shifting salience. So depending upon where I am, certain identities are more prevalent to my oppressor than others, right? So when I'm, in a white environment, they care more that I'm black than if I'm pink, right? Or if you're in a black environment, you got a black church, they care more that I'm like transgender, non-conforming than they do when they care about my race, right? Or if it shifts depending on where you are. And so I think the difficult part with trying to establish a definition of safety is how do we manage it, right?
Yeah.
Or how do we develop, like they were saying, like a space where freedom can exist for everybody? Like how do we live a liberated life? And I feel like it's just so complex, and I'm just sitting here and I'm just thinking how frustrated it makes me, because it's just like, there's really just no solution. But I'm just grateful. I just wanted to thank you for the work that you're doing and what you're saying, talking about the blackness experiences. We got to find these girls and the killing of trans women. There's just so much going on right now. And for us to even be able to just commune and have a discussion about what's going on, because, people who are privileged and, it's almost like a matrix, red pill, blue pill. Like, you can choose to acknowledge it and keep living on life, right? Or you can address it and deal with it head on. So, thank you. I feel all that.
I mean, when you talk about the shifting spaces of salience, a big part of the safety thing that I think about a lot, that I don't want to kind of overstep as a cis woman, is like the way that we come at trans women's gender expression, right? So there's this tendency within kind of radical queer spaces to shit on femininity for some reason. And it's not for some reason, we know why. And this particular willingness and desire to shit on black femininity, when I think we, as people who have never had, so yeah, I can say that like black womanhood is denied of me, but I have never had anybody ever question whether or not I'm a real woman. And there's a tendency to, you know, if we're abolishing gender, we're annihilating gender, we're freeing ourselves from the shackle of patriarchy, why are we wearing lipstick and nail polish? Like, fuck that. There's a tendency to completely overlook the ways in which they're not only part of trans women's or femmes' kind of aesthetic preferences, but also exist as a really important part of a politic of safety, where the difference between being able to walk down the street with relative safety or be attacked is determined by how convincingly you can play woman on a particular day.
Pass. Well, we call pass.
Right. You know, and if you look at the history, for example, of like gender clinics, right? Like you had all of these male doctors trying to tell, you know, deciding who gets to be able to transition based on what they perceive to be the most convincing kind of woman. And if you had too much hair, if you were too big bone, like you didn't get to be a woman. And if you were small and you're kind of dainty and you weren't so hairy and you were kind of lucky, you got to be a woman. And it's you know, in the ways that's, yeah, don't, you know, the bell hooks thing, like this whole second wave refusal to recognize the legitimacy of femininity as not a slave to patriarchy, but as a thing that is powerful, that is a choice, that is a part of our agency, that is a part of the way that we decide to be in the world. For me, that's also a really important part of my politic of safety and my black feminist.
It's crazy that you mentioned Cece, and that you mentioned that you were from Minnesota, so Cece McDonald. And it's funny because, like, if y'all know her story, like you said at first, it was white people that yelled the race thing first, and then they were like, oh, those are chicks from this, and then they started going further, you know. So I think around, like, for me, I love what you said. Like, I don't take public transport either. Like, if people ask me to go somewhere, I'm like, are you taking me? You know, because like for a fatter body person, it's really hard. And like, so I think these kind of conversations, not just in anarchist space, I'm not an anarchist, they need to fucking happen, right? For us to actually destroy capitalism, destroy imperialism, destroy patriarchy, destroy transphobia, which all those systems are housing this shit, right? So I think for me, in terms of like, y'all, we gotta get this fucking together. And I'm not talking as a trans black woman or cis woman. Some cis black women, yes, keeping it real. But mainly, we gotta get it together. Like, men, rise the fuck up. Like, women, like, we are.
But there's also, and there's something also that's really, when it comes when we're talking about labor, right? Emotional labor, we're talking about reproductive labor. And there's also this obligation when it comes to safety, that the people who are kind of the most vulnerable at risk are also the ones who are responsible for mitigating their own risk in a particular space, right? So I don't want to be raped when I go to the bar, so I'll wear a turtleneck and some baggy pants. You know, this responsibility that we are responsible for our own victimization. And there's a particularly insidious gaslighting that goes into that. That goes into, if you are targeted, you are not being safe enough. When, how can I ever be safe in a body that is marked in these particular ways that make me, that make me so. I don't have answers. Beyond answers.
How does the journey of like colonizing everything or whatever it is that you need to look like? How does it help in the healing process, or how does it help or how does it?
So I think one of the most healing things for me was when I stopped dating white men.
Oh.
No, because my whole kind of sense of self, so I grew up in Missouri, right? So I know this really white Midwestern struggle. And I have, my parents are from Zimbabwe, so I'm also, first generation American. And being a first generation Black American means that we have kind of these weird chips on our shoulders because we have convinced ourselves that we are kind of at the top of the hierarchy of Black people because we're African. And so much of what I understood about myself was violently anti-Black. Whereas I just heard it from my parents as being like, well, just work hard, you can do as much as white people can. And I was like, okay, cool, so like I want to be like them. The way that I talked, they always told me that I wasn't really Black. That's a compliment because Blackness is bad. And so my whole way of understanding myself as a woman, as someone who's desirable, as someone who is worthy, I thought that like Squirrel Love shit was hella cute for a bit. I thought that all of these celebrations of interraciality were hella cute for a bit. And then, I took, super cliched, I took a Black consciousness class in college. And, I had an obvious understanding that like people weren't in these positions of, they weren't being colonized because they deserved it, right? Black Americans haven't been subjugated for 500 years because they deserve it. And so I came to realize the way that I understood myself was very anti-Black, the way that I understood Black people in America was super anti-Black. And that is something that is still kind of operating in the back of my mind because anti-Blackness is something that's hard to unlearn. It's something all y'all gotta do, but it's still hard to unlearn. And when I stopped seeking validation from what I perceived to be the most powerful thing, from what I perceived to be the thing that could bestow empowerment and praise and worth and value upon me, that is when I fundamentally, like my relationship with my body was fundamentally changing the way that I understood Black community and sisterhood. And that didn't all just come from not dating white men anymore, but that I think was a really pivotal kind of shift in the way that I looked at myself, in the way that I looked at Blackness, in the way that I looked at Black womanhood.
Thank you. It feels like we don't really get to, like, we're just so, like, we're just always carrying that trauma, right? Like, that continuous trauma, whether you call it genetic memory, ancestral memory, like, whatever it is. There's trauma with that, and, like, I feel like, at least, I don't know. I feel like it's time to, like, fucking
And that's something that I love so much about womanism is because there's, Russell Means in his whole rejection of kind of Marxism as something that isn't fundamentally different from capitalism is he talks about how all of like Western Orthodox thoughts is dehumanizing because people are kind of seen as these like little parts of a machine for industrialization, for revolution and whatever, and we're deeply disconnected from our humanity, from our shared humanity. And when not to fetishize, when I began to learn more about like indigenous ways of knowing community, of knowing organization, of relating to communities, when I started to learn more about that in my own culture in Zimbabwe, when I started to have more conversations with healer friends, when I learned about that fact that womanism is not just this kind of like fiercely political thing, it is also a deeply spiritual thing. And there are so many ways of reclaiming Christianity, of making relationship with Jesus, of making relationship with yourself. I mean, I'm not a Christian, but that so deeply resonated with me. And it's something that I'm beginning to learn and realize more and more and more is that this revolutionary work cannot be decoupled from this kind of spiritual work because capitalism is social death, right? It's social and spiritual and emotional and mental murder. And if we're going to reclaim systems, if we're going to imagine new systems, we have to reimagine new ways of knowing ourselves, of being in ourselves, of embodying knowledge, and doing knowledge and being in this world that we're doing. But yeah, no, for the
I like one thing so is like how big it is in our like Black part of right? Like even in Mexico we don't acknowledge, like barely acknowledge, like then we have our friends that are like lighter skin, our colorism, all that shit, like that internalized like no, you're better because you're lighter, no you're better because you're older, like that happens in our own communities, in our own families, and they're like we're darker, we're lighter in our own systems. I feel like it taught me a lot to be able to be like, no, that's fucked up, and I call it on lack of love for herself when my sister gave her love and her dad was kind of like, what is this? Like, that's like so much shit that's been carried from a child that knows and is not even aware of like how the outside world is like gonna be, but is already like
Is already internalized.
because all that. And I think like one thing that I want to acknowledge is like I've been very molded and supported through music and art by Black women since I was young, and I never knew that. And brown women, but Black women have been there, and that's just crazy because I didn't really have any Black women around me. Like, but now I do, and it makes me it's very honorable because it's like the art, like with the sisters, you know, we need to acknowledge that healing process, and we need to stick together, women and trans women together, and we need to. So thank you guys. Thank you guys.
And it's also the fact that, like, you know, as you touched on, Black womanhood kind of exists in everything, right? Like, Black women are always these healers, are always these cultural producers, are always these things that are so influential in creating all of these things, and yet when it comes down to the wire, and we need somebody to show up to keep us safe, you know, we can be commodified in these particular ways, but we can never have this kind of the same energy that is put into the world, into in these creative ways, like reciprocated back to us. And there's something that, any last couple of questions? Oh, yeah.
I have one last. You know, this is like the area in Anaheim and Santa Ana where I actually live is predominantly Latino. And one of the questions that I have is how bridges can be built between Black and brown people, because I actually see, I actually have seen personally a lot of division in that, and there's very few Black people in this area in comparison to other parts of the country. So that my question is about that, because I even think in the room that there's a large Latino audience, and so my question is, how are those bridges built? Because the struggle is different, but it's very relevant now for the Latino community. And as people reach out to look at civil rights movements and things that have happened in America, the struggle is not exactly the same struggle, but I don't know how that bridge is created. And she mentioned a little while ago, Cynthia, I think, about that there is a casta system in Latino, I mean, that's shown. So you start to hear that. I hear it here, and I'm really curious about that.
So one thing for me that I think is really important as we're trying to kind of make coalitions as like non-white folks is this acknowledgement that in so many ways, race is organized around anti-Blackness. It's not the only important thing that it's organized around, because I don't want to make invisible like the fact that Indigenous people are invisible for a reason, and they are not seen for a reason, and they are not here for a reason. And so much of race is also revolved around the genocide of, you know, that's not, you know. And also there is this way in which all people are taught to be invested in anti-Blackness, right? Like, how did the Irish become white? What was this process of going from, you know, no dogs, no niggers, no Irish to like Irish Americans being a critical part of like the carceral system. And so the first thing for me in terms of coalition building and building with Black folks is the necessity to very earnestly confront anti-Blackness in communities, because Black people, we're not going to want to come to a space where we feel like this is supposed to be this kind of like radical generative space, and all we're going to do is be like, hey, that's fucked up, you can't say that, hey, please don't say that, hey, that's actually so racist. That's not to pretend that people are going to be perfect forever, or people are always going to be perfect and people are never going to make mistakes, but I think one of the most important things is recognizing investment in anti-Blackness, and then also the ways in which like Black folks are reactively perpetuating kind of ethno-racial antagonisms because we are being attacked in all of these ways. And so I don't exactly know what that looks like. I feel like it looks like you know, obviously having conversations, having dialogue, and I mean, in the case of getting Black folks to move to Anaheim, like, I don't know. I don't know enough about Anaheim to be like, hey guys, like, come back. Or like, come for the first time.
It's happening.
But,
It's the most black city in Washington. But that doesn't say.
Oh.
well, I live in Oakland also, so like,
Oh.
what does the most black look like? But it's certainly about like, I think all of this is not so much about this kind of shit slinging that can come from privilege call-outs of the ways in which like calling out privilege silences, but in earnestly recognizing the fact that like by the simple merit of being in a body and occupying an identity, you are simultaneously, for the most part, both oppressed and an oppressor. And it's recognizing the fact that like, yes, I'm a Black woman, I'm a queer woman, I'm also a cis woman, I'm non-disabled. What does that mean? It looks like recognizing and confronting that, as opposed to the goal of all of our anti-bigotry or radical politics being to stop being a thing. Because I will never stop being transphobic, I will never stop being ableist because of the simple merit of my socialization into a particular gender identity, occupying a particular body. It's about recognizing the fact that like our responsibility is harm reduction, right? Because what's the point of having a revolution if everybody's dead? What's the point of planning for it? You know, I don't, maybe that answered you. I hope it did.
I think one.
Yeah, no, sorry, just
One mantra that I think I feel like I hear a lot in anarchist spaces is like no gods, no masters. And for me, I felt like that never really resonated with me, not because I'm a religious person, because I'm not, but just feeling really connected to my own spirituality, to my own spirit. And so you kind of talked a little bit about that, so I wanted to hear more about your thoughts on how spirituality does come into, like how that can also be a part of your anarchism.
So, someone who is super, super influential to me as a Zimbabwean woman, as a resistor, is the person that we refer to as the mother of our nation. Her name is Mbuya Nehanda. And Nehanda was the spiritual leader of the Shona people during the, I don't remember the British when they came and fucked some stuff up, but she galvanized the Shona resistance against the British alongside the Ndebele people. And she was ultimately executed. It took, according to the legend, which I kind of love, right? It took 3 attempts to hang her. And before she died, she said, you know, my bones will rise again. And they kind of they took that as this kind of prophetic thing that predicted the liberation war that started at the end of the 60s. And I think for me, there's something intensely powerful about understanding the knowledge and the ways of resisting that my ancestors participated in. Like, I've had ancestors who were killed by the British in resisting colonial encroachment, and there's so much power that it kind of draw from the memory of what they did. And I don't know, it's incredibly powerful to me. Someone in an anarchist space told me that it was incredibly regressive, that someone as intelligent as I am is a believer in these nonsensical things. But he's not paying my rent, he's not my father, and so I don't give a shit. But I think that whatever motivators you have that drive you, right? If it's connecting with ancestors, if it's communing with other healers, if it's healing people, if it's whatever, I think that this healing work is essential because capitalism wants us to die, right? These systems are created to sap us of our energy, of our mental and emotional strength and capacity of everything. And I think that spirituality, whatever you may believe, if you don't, that's also super cool, but I think that spirituality is an incredibly important part of sustaining us emotionally, and that's something that we tend to neglect as we do this like heavily theoretical work. And the realness of our work is proof through our ability to memorize and regurgitate all of these important theoretical things in years and shit. And I think that, like, not to be sappy, but like loving one another is incredibly powerful. Figuring out ways of connecting beyond our shared ideology is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I'll ask one more question.
One more question.
guess more of like a comment to some of what people have been talking about in terms of the work it takes to undo anti-blackness within like maybe a non-black area or a city. And like, yeah, just everything that you're saying really, really resonated with some of us, me particularly very much. There's no like, yeah, there's no, I don't have like it's surprising for an anarchist book fair actually, but considering, you know, it just takes a lot of work in terms of like the internal work it has taken to like undo a lot of like, you know, things that subordinated me as like, you know, black trans femme person, and I think like what I'm not seeing in a lot of the spaces, particularly anarchist spaces, is that same like internal anti-blackness as much as you know we internalize that, and it's important because like you know considering yeah just like self-worth and people just hating themselves because of who they are, what society has taught them to be, and how much work it is to actually overcome that. And like if there are comrades that are also doing the same thing, yeah, that's just really helpful. I also am like trapped in this kind of like I know you were talking a little bit on yeah, do you so for me I feel really when it comes to human rights or humanity, it's really hard to like adapt or to think that like, oh, you know, after like generations of being left out of this like kind of like human family tree as black people, what's the point of us, you know, trying to, you know, gain that positionality?
Try?
You know, yeah, what's the point of doing that if like it's inherent, like it's pretty much inherently, our positionality is inherently humanizing. So I just wanted to know, yeah, what your take on like human rights as like or humanity as like this end all be all, like save us, or is it like, will we be liberated if we stop it actually dismantle civil society as it is? And like how, you know, what it takes to dismantle that, yeah.
I guess quickly. So I'm not an optimist, right? I'm not a particularly like cheery person who has like faith in people. I don't, but that's not what kind of is driving me, right? Like Malcolm X's quote about by any means necessary. It's not a matter of whether or not I believe in humanity, but I'm a fucking human being and I have fucking rights and I'm going to be here and I'm going to beat your ass until you believe it. And it's not so much a belief or an investment in humanity, although I am deeply invested in humanity, but more so a refusal on my behalf to stop, if that makes sense. And I do it because if I want to continue to be alive, I don't have a choice but to continue to do it. And I thank y'all for coming.